Hello lovelies, got a double header for you today. We're going to look at the current edition of Savage Worlds, and we're going to look at the current edition of Deadlands for Savage Worlds. So Savage Worlds is a universal system that isn't particularly universal. It's very much aimed at the kind of pulp, action-adventure sort of side of gaming. And pulp gaming has always been far more popular with games masters and games designers than it has turned out to be with gamers, which is unfortunate because it is a rich vein that is relatively untapped, or at least relatively untapped successfully. So this is the newest edition, slightly smaller format book, which I quite like. Very glossy, very well presented, possibly over-presented in some cases. Because it's a generic system, there isn't a huge amount of consistency to the artistic presentation, but then you wouldn't expect it to, because it's supposed to be telling you, all about the possibilities and the breadth of those possibilities. So, that's fine. It does tap in a bit to their various licensed properties. Solomon Kane, Lankmar, Rifts, of course, they now have, and God, anything is a better system than the Palladium system for Rifts. Though personally I found Fate to be weirdly good for running Rifts. So this is very broad but very shallow because this is the core book. So you've got a character who is defined by their attributes. Their attributes are the usual sorts of things. You also have skills and derived stats. Attributes are weirdly de-emphasized. Like, if you're going to do something, like punch someone, in a normal game you might expect to be rolling whatever your strength type statistic is, plus whatever your skill type attribute is, and that would give you the result. Savage Worlds, no. Kind of like Fate, second comparison, I guess, except Fate doesn't have statistics. No, you just, if you've got the skill, you roll on the skill. If you don't have the skill, most of the time, instead of the stat, you'll be rolling a d4 and taking away 2. But because you're a wildcard hero, you'll also be rolling a d6 and taking away 2. That's a kind of edge that it gives to heroes. So that's the basis of the system. You have a dice continuum, d4, d6, d8, d10, d12, which is determined by either your attribute or your skill. You're rolling that and you're trying to get 4 or over. And if you... how to describe it? Yeah, but basically attributes don't modify the skill. You don't add them together. Yeah, if you don't have the skill, you're pretty much shafted, unless it's something that can be determined to only really rely on your statistics. So the only real influence that the statistics have is that they shift what your derived statistics are, and they somewhat, but not as much as in earlier editions, they somewhat limit what level your skills can be at. Then you have edges, which play the same sort of role as feats in D20, using that as the common language of games, which are various exceptions to the rules or access to special abilities and so on. Right, so those are all exceptions, and because your character tends to accrue edges from various sources, that rapidly complicates matters, especially when edges start interacting with each other. So like a lot of simple systems, the core is very simple, but then they rapidly add a whole bunch of stuff on top of it that makes things rapidly trickier. This isn't as bad as Tristat, but it's still a mark against the system, I think. And because it uses such a compressed scale, and because things don't combine, it can feel difficult to get particularly meaningful character progression out of Savage Worlds. This was true of earlier versions as well, in Deadlands and so on. So it might be useful to view it the same way you might view Traveller, where you're playing someone who is competent and is about as competent as they're gonna be. There are rules for rapid leveling and so on, but as a generic system, that relative lack of granularity certainly presents something of an issue to my mind, which means for me at least Savage Worlds seems like it's far more configured towards and suitable for one-shots, short arc campaigns, heroic campaigns, again relatively short ones. For very long-term play, I don't see Savage Worlds as being particularly suitable. There are rules for superhero powers, occult abilities, all of that kind of thing, but they're kind of bolt-ons, and even this many years later on from the first release of Deadlands, all of these add-ons still feel a bit clunky, even though they've been tested to death. I haven't had much success with Savage Worlds outside of using it for Deadlands, and then primarily for Deadlands Wasted West. It retains many of the features that I did like about that, specifically with your character flaws. You not only get points to spend to improve your character, but it encourages the player to bring up those flaws and hindrances during play in order to get bennies, which are tokens. All right, and then you spend those to modify your rolls, act more heroically, things like that. So yeah, again, the core system is perfectly cromulent, very very simple. Can be used in a wide variety of settings, provided that they are that kind of pulpy action adventure sort of setting. Vehicle rules don't work fantastically well, but they're there, and they're better than some offerings in some other games. If you wanted to run a mecha game, it's quite difficult to do effectively with Savage Worlds. And that's one of the major failures I had trying to kick the tires of the system and to run a mecha-based game, which was about sort of Catholic power armor wearers fighting demons, but it just wouldn't work. I would have been better using something else. Though that was the earlier Big Brown Book edition of Savage Worlds. So I guess I'm actually kind of done with talking about the core system here, though we should talk about the tokens and things, right? Because Savage Worlds, rooted in Deadlands as it was, plays on the chips and cards motif quite a lot. You use chips for your bennies, which used to contribute towards experience but doesn't anymore, and you use cards for initiative and invocation of some powers and things like that, right? Which makes Savage Worlds more difficult to play online because it is harder to keep track of these sorts of things. Certain VTTs cope with it better than others. Others don't cope with it very well at all. Screen space is often at a premium and so on, and playing in person, it's great if it fits the theme of what you're playing. Even better. So with Deadlands, outside of those contexts, I think it's kind of a pain in the ass, if I'm completely honest. And certainly makes things more difficult playing online. But we may well give it a go with this version of the rules at some point in the near future. So, style-wise, the art's great. It's a nice solid book. I prefer the format. It is a lot of bare text, which isn't laid out tremendously well. I'm being slightly hypercritical because I would have used Savage Worlds for a couple of my releases, but their licensing agreements are kind of annoying and restrictive in a time of in a time of the open gaming license, and creating material for all these other games, they're a bit more restrictive and take a bit tighter ownership of things. And the easiest thing to do would be to publish under the Savage Worlds sub-license thing on DriveThruRPG, which gives you a certain degree of latitude, but you would have to do your print through DriveThruRPG as well if you were to offer print, and Lightning Source just isn't up to snuff for me, so I don't want to do that. So yeah, a bit of a quandary, but one of their conditions is the quality of presentation. So given that they're refusing people on that basis, I feel empowered to be a bit critical here. Even so, style for substance, it's a complete system, but it has some fairly severe flaws and problems, which won't necessarily affect all of you, but for me, the lack of capacity for truly long-term play is an issue for me. And the various sort of hinks and bolt-ons that don't quite work are also a bit of a problem for me. Despite years of streamlining and refinement, there are still points at which it becomes very clunky indeed. The conviction system, for example, feels like it should have been integrated into something else, extra Benny points or something. It's clumsy, but then that's how a lot of universal systems are. You start with a base simple concept, and then by the time you finish modifying it, you have a complicated beast. But you can always substitute your own rules, and it might be fun to increase the dice range by using DCC dice as well, which is I wonder if anyone's done that. Right, let's have a look at Deadlands. So here's the latest version of Deadlands for Savage Worlds, the thing that started it all, I guess. And the big question, I suppose, that most people have is, can you fit all the content from a normal-sized, hardback RPG tome in a smaller format RPG tome of less pages than most modern RPG tomes, especially considering the longevity of Deadlands and the sheer amount of content that has been put out for it. I mean, you don't have to reprint all the rules because you've got your separate core book, right? So that should save you a bit of space. But the long and the short of it is, no, you can't really do Deadlands justice in this many smaller pages. This is really more like a primer. If you've still got your old books, then you'll find a lot more and more useful information in them. And because the system is so simple, cross-compatibility is largely there. It's not too difficult to do that. This is very much a whistle-stop tour. I kind of felt like someone riding on the rail, and the train's going full tilt, and all these little interesting places are just whooshing by too fast for you to really get a look at them or get your teeth into them. The original Deadlands wasn't exactly a class-based system, but it did have sort of very strongly identified character templates and so on, whereas Savage Worlds is now much more of an open, generic system. So this book has to kind of try and split the difference between the two. You can make up whatever character you want, largely, still, but there are very, very strongly identified templates which are all but character classes, really. And if you want to be effective in any of those, you definitely have to pursue that particular line. I guess this is a steampunk game, given that the Wild West is concurrent with Victoriana. But it has that same problem that I have with most steampunk games, in that they don't play it straight. I like the difference engine. I don't like, just sticking cogs on things and throwing magic and so on into it all. Like Victoriana has a 5th edition compatible version coming out, which is talk about timing with the new, with the new edition of D&D coming out, which is about to render all of that redundant. They couldn't leave well enough alone either. Victoriana is full of elves and magic and demons and gods, and has become increasingly coggy over time, you might say. Now, these are my personal hang-ups. You don't have to agree with my assessment. You don't have to agree with my taste when it comes to these things, but I would really like to see a sort of harder sci-fi, harder alternate history version of Victoriana, and this certainly isn't it. This is very, very Weird West. So we've gone over rules when we talked about Savage Worlds. So what is there to talk about in this? Funnily enough, the Pinkertons are in it. And there are people who do their magic using cards, hucksters. So it might be fun to do a Pinkertons versus hucksters scenario, just to rip the piss out of Wizards of the Coast. That might be fun. You've got preachers, you've got kung fu masters, which kind of seems like it doesn't fit, but it does, because there's a lot of crossover between the themes in Japanese and Chinese cinema, and between westerns. And there were a lot of Chinese who often get overlooked in America during roughly this period. So it kind of makes sense, but it does feel slightly jarring in the core book, and possibly as if it should have been passed out to something else. The Harrowed are interesting. These are people who resurrect from the dead, inhabited and possessed by a Manitou. I've got to say, I'm surprised that they haven't gotten in trouble for including Native American beliefs and magic and spiritualism, but I don't know, maybe they get a pass, maybe it gets grandfathered in, I don't know. The hucksters thing, I never cottoned to hucksters in previous editions. It always seemed kind of nonsensical to use poker as a mechanic for magic, despite fighting fantasy gambler jobs and all the rest of it. I think it does a better job of explaining it and saying that you're kind of dealing with the devil, and that's how it works. That's where the arcane power comes from. So it makes a bit more sense. Mad scientists exist in this world, and they are empowered by two things: the whispering of more evil spirits in their heads, and the existence of ghost rock, which is essentially the same as necrotite in Iron Kingdoms. It's the congealed souls of the damned, and that's what enables a whole bunch of weird and freaky science to work and operate. They do kind of memory hole the whole slavery thing, even though the Civil War is important in this timeline as it was in the real timeline. It is a fantastical world, he says, pointing at the skeletons on a steam train, but I really dislike, as a historian, people's tendency in modern game design to paper over the cracks of history, to ignore nasty, negative things that happened in history as if that's somehow doing people a favour, or making the game more engaging. If we could travel back in time, we would probably oppose these terrible things that happened, and games are almost a way to do that. So, the opportunity to play Django from the Quentin Tarantino version, that would be fun, but you need the background against which to play an escaped slave or whatever else, right? And similarly, if you wanted to embody the ideals of John Brown or whatever. You need that background to do it. So it's a shame that they've kind of shied away from history. So, I mean, this is basically just a book of options and add-ons, and for my money, it doesn't really spend enough time on the world itself. Like I say, it's just that kind of whistle-stop tour. I haven't checked into what other supporting material they've done. Hopefully there are decent world guides and stuff as well on top of this. But yeah, having access to many of the old books and Wasted West, I get my background information from that. But for someone coming to the game new, I think this is a detriment somewhat. I don't know that I have a lot else to say. Yeah, it's never quite been to my personal taste because I find it too kind of campy and cheesy. It would be possibly good for doing a version of that alternate Tenra Bansha Zero setting, Terror the Gunslinger. It might be good for doing something like that if you can find a translation, which you can't, and I keep making a start and then stopping my translation because it's too much work. But yeah, I don't know. This version just doesn't do it for me in the way that the older, slightly more baroque and characterful, shall we say, version did, and the new version of Savage Worlds is a better, cleaner system, but still has its issues, and again lacks that sort of charming quirkiness of the older versions of the system, which did sell me on it. Style-wise, I mean, obviously this has a much more cohesive look to it because it's all one setting. I just don't think it spends enough time setting the scene and drawing you into the world compared to older versions of the same material. In terms of substance, I think it's lacking. I mean, you've got your monsters, you've got your character options and so on, but again, it fails to provide you with sufficient information about the setting to really get into it, to get caught up in it and enthused. I mean, a lot of that stuff is older forms of game design like metaplot and so on that was there across books, which have fallen out of favour, but even so, just the amount of useful information and story hooks and so on in the older material is just better. So as a source book, it doesn't grab me. To an extent, that's a subjective thing, but I feel that it is mostly because material is missing, and so in terms of substance, I can only really give it a 3. So that's 7 out of 10, 3.5 out of 5. If you already have a Deadlands collection and you're updating everything to the new version of Savage Worlds, great. Otherwise, not so much. Sang.
Get some plastic surgery against this society. Entropy, apathy, morality, totality. Makeup of your final days. Survival of the fittest haze. Might is right on praise. Smoke and mirrors, twisted maze. Are you strong enough to meet in style? Will you wear your stockings to the trial? Leave the jury in denial. Wear your stockings to the trial. Wear your stockings to the trial.
Sup. I'm reliably informed that I'm terrible at pimping my stuff, so here I am, pimping my stuff You can buy most of the shit that I make over at post-mort.com. Hope to see you there.